we'll just jump right in. So here we are picking up book 10, and we left off on our previous episode. Just to kind of do a quick summary. So we just finished reading about how Socrates had a very critical view of poetry and the arts in general, because he viewed the products of poetry and art, which we can call mimesis, as the furthest removed from the truth. And the central critique behind his restrictions of poetry and artistry in the Republic was because it seemed to turn the citizens away from being, right? So that the being aspect of the divided line, and more toward the becoming aspect, which is it reinforces appearances at the expense of pursuit of the truth, to put it simply. Now, he also put it in terms of the fact that it seemed to feed the passions, feed the spirited element, again, at the expense of starving the rational element, which often has to transcend the emotional reactivity that is part of the response people have to artistic creations and to poetry. And so then he also talked about, the three levels of understanding, per se, the three levels of, the grasp one can have on reality. And so there is the analogy he made of the maker of the thing and the thing itself, where he had, we'll say, God or nature as the maker of the concept. And we use the analogy of a shoe, like a basketball shoe, and so you would have nature has the concept out there, the form of the basketball shoe, or God's shoe, what you would consider the ideal shoe as a concept. And then at the next level, so now two places removed from the truth would be the maker of the shoe. So either Nike and or the user of the shoe, in this case, Michael Jordan, because we were talking about Air Jordans. And then the position that holds the third place removed from the truth would be, for example, the advertisers, who they're more focused on paintings of the shoe and representations of the shoe, appearances of the shoe that are largely two-dimensional and furthest removed from the actual thing. And he used that as an analogy. We use that as an analogy for what you could say mimesis is. And from there, Socrates then started to talk about the writings of Homer, which back then were very obviously influential culturally and were used as a touchstone. Part of the canon of Greek culture were the Homeric epics, and Socrates really advised caution in terms of the readings, because there is a propensity to put the source of the material, the written material, over the substance of the material. And by that I mean people were ascribing to some of the ideals and events that were represented in Homer's epics simply because it was Homer writing them, who was a very good writer, very influential. But as Socrates pointed out, he was 3 times removed from the truth, because while he may have written about courageous acts, such as those of Socrates and some of the other players in the Iliad and the Odyssey, Homer himself was not known for performing courageous acts. Homer himself was not known for leading an army into battle. Homer himself was not known for doing anything, practically speaking, to improve the lives of his fellow citizens. And yet he is somebody indirectly, vis-a-vis his epics, who is referenced or used as kind of a guiding point to make decisions and that sort of thing. And so that's kind of where we left off. And then Socrates here at this point has a pivot, because we now are going to talk about the immortal soul. And there's a cryptic comment that Socrates makes at about 614a, where he says, he's talking about the benefits of the just life. And he says that while the just man is alive, there are the sorts of prizes, wages, and gifts he receives from gods and human beings, in addition to those good things that justice itself provides. But they are nothing in number or size compared to those that await each man after death. And so now we move into this idea of the immortal soul. And so Socrates at this point makes a logical argument for why he believes the soul is immortal. Okay?
Yeah. Going to this point, in the Republic, it is the journey is one of self-discovery. We are creating a republic, an ordered republic inside our minds. And so how does one go about achieving that? And part of that is to come to understand human nature, that as humans, we are more likely to be taken in by things that are appetitive in nature than by things that are rational. Because rational seems very boring at the outset. And we are drawn to works that also depict that aspect of appetitive behavior over rational behavior. Simply put, the Homer's Odyssey and Iliad are probably read a lot more frequently than Plato's Republic. And there's a reason for that. Now, Socrates is cautioning us not just about the fact that this is Homer. Like, he's not just saying that don't read Homer. He's cautioning against this kind of literature, this kind of communication that plays on the appetitive aspect and it gets us drawn in. And so when we see these heroes of the Homeric epics behaving in ways that are emotional and irrational, it gives us a pass. We say, if Achilles can behave like this, well then,
right, it has a sort of a normalizing effect, and the audience has a tendency to model what they see.
And so there has to be somebody who helps you find the hidden allegory behind these great works. The problem is, most folks that one would come across would be drawn into the emotional aspect of it. One would not find the truth seeker who's looking at the shadows that are being cast on the wall and saying, oh, you know what, these are shadows. I've actually seen the light. And now I can tell you what these represent or what this all means. As opposed to somebody who's staring at the wall of the cave and looking at shadows and getting very good at predicting those shadows is giving you advice. So one has to find that. And that's what Socrates is in the Republic, is that individual who's being able to find, he's constantly the pursuit of knowledge, truth, beauty, goodness. And if you're following along with him, he will tell you that he does not know, but he is going to make sure that you understand that you don't know either. And not knowing that one does not know anything is one of the pinnacles of human knowledge. Because at that point you have burnt away, as you say, the all the dry wood, and you're now left with what is left now.
Right.
Knowing that you don't know anything is knowing something.
Yeah.
As opposed to not knowing anything and just having a false opinion.
Yeah, I still think there's kind of a source. There's still a caution, though, because it's not so much that he's saying don't read Homer. He's saying don't just read something because it was written by Homer, and this is why. And it's because he has. You don't want to get information from somebody who doesn't have the lived experience of the thing that you're trying to learn about, right? And that's the main thing.
That comes to that brings us to the second part of that. The first part is don't understand that you would be drawn into the emotional aspects
Right.
of it. You will lose out on the allegorical aspects of what is being discussed.
Right. There's definitely two parts to it.
And the second part of it is just don't blindly follow somebody because other people say that he's great or because this person's written great books. And what has this person done? Actions is what should count and not words. And Socrates never wrote anything. It was all action. And people wrote about his actions. So it makes sense. Now, this point, it comes because we are talking about what do we expose ourselves to, who do we read. It comes at the kind of the fag end of the Republic, because one made their journey all the way, read this logical argument, which is it's interesting to very few people. We find it interesting. Most people won't. And once you get to this point, one is more likely to understand this point. The point that if this doesn't read like a sci-fi novel, right? It doesn't read like that. But there's something to be said about the pursuit of truth. It gives you a certain sense of achievement, happiness, understanding of because you followed along with somebody like Socrates. They've taken you through it, and the last point, what the capstone on this was the fact that it is much more difficult to be a good person than it is to be a bad person. And this endeavor of reading the Republic is a very small example of what that would mean. If one was following wisdom, one is pursuing wisdom, is pursuing understanding of what it is to be ethical, what is justice, what's temperance, what's courage.
Right, the pursuit of the just life.
Right. That examine life is hard. Reading the Republic is hard. And but being good is hard. And so that is kind of the ending of this particular argument, is that line by Socrates where he says, Glaucon, doing good things, being good is actually harder. Then he says, okay, now that we've come to this point, we've come to understand how one can be good, one now has to talk about this aspect of what does one get for being good. Because whatever be the sphere of human life and our experience, it is but mere moments in the history of the universe. From if you look at immeasurable time, a human life of whatever 60, 80 years is but a moment, an instance. And so whatever one gets during this period of life, be it good, be it bad, is of no consequence, just given the expanse of time. So why then does it matter to do any of this? Why be good? Why be evil? Why be anything? Be pure evil. Doesn't matter, because at best you have 80 years. Out of that, you spend 20, 40 years getting to a position where you can in fact be that evil. And then you have maybe another 20 years where you could, and then you're gone. Like that 20 years time and 14 point some billion years means nothing. So what's the point? Why should one even talk about this aspect? And that's where he says that he comes to the point of why should one still be concerned about being good, doing good acts. And that's what then the conversation then moves on to the fact that yes, our bodies are gone, but there's an aspect of us that remains, is immortal. And Glaucon says, "Whoa, wait a minute! You're saying that there's something called the soul, and that is immortal? Like, do you have proof of this? That's a big statement that you're making, Socrates." And Socrates is like, "Yeah, I think we can logically deduce the fact that there is, in fact, a soul that exists." And that leads to a fascinating, I think there are 3 or 4 pages that he very logically talks about why. And so do you want to...
Yeah, I mean, so at this point, Socrates is sort of walking Glaucon through the logical rationale behind his claim that the soul is immortal. And it's an important point to understand because, as you say, Socrates is taking a very transcendent view of the soul. And if the soul is immortal, we'll get into why he thinks the rationale behind it, but if the soul is immortal, then you're right. Then these trials and tribulations that you go through really become sort of secondary and largely not necessarily even the focus of your life at all. And really what the focus of your life, the living the best life that you can live possible, really should be one that's focused on being just, regardless of what trials and tribulations, triumphs come your way, because your job to live the best life is essentially to be just through all of that. And that's how you achieve the best life that you can live. But the rationale kind of goes like this. And so you have to work under the premise that there's good things and there's bad things to whatever concept you're looking at. Okay, if you're looking at the human body, for example. And so the things that are good are the things that preserve you and improve you. Okay, and anything that does that, we'll lump that into the category of, okay, well, this is good. And then things that corrupt or destroy, that gets lumped into the category of things that are bad. And so then he goes into the analogy of the human body, which is to say things like nourishment. So like food and fluids, that in moderation, that's going to be beneficial to the body. So that would be a good. But then disease and injury would be like the harm, and that's what destroys the body. And so he elaborates this idea that something can be destroyed by its own intrinsic devices. He has this great analogy of an individual who eats rotten food, gets sick from it, and dies. And he points out rather astutely that it's actually not the food per se that kills the individual, that kills the body. It's sort of the diseases inherent within the design framework of the body that allow for its own destruction to happen. Yeah. And so things get undone by the bad. Right. So then if you try to do that analogy to the soul, he says if you try to do that with the soul, though, something strange happens, because you could say that virtue is the good. Virtue is the thing that keeps the soul in alignment with the three elements all in their proper order. And vice is the thing that deranges the soul, that puts it out of order. But vice doesn't destroy the soul, right? So he gives the example of the person who is unjust and is convicted and is condemned by his peers for being unjust. Does this individual die? Do they evaporate? Do they just vanish? Mm-hmm. And they don't. Mm-hmm. And so he's saying there's something different about the soul. And not only that, when an individual themselves gets sick or die, that, since it's not of the realm of the soul, that also doesn't destroy the soul. So the fact that you have nothing that actually destroys the soul, not even vice, then he makes the claim at this point that the soul's immortal. The three readings that basically elaborate this would be, so on 609D, he talks about, do any of these, again, he's talking about the things that destroy the soul. He talks about vice. He's talking about injustice, intemperance, cowardice, and ignorance. Do any of these things break it down and destroy it? He says, think about it. So we're not deceived into believing that when an unjust and foolish person is caught, he is destroyed by injustice, which is a deficiency in a soul. Instead, let's proceed this way. Just as the body's deficiency, which is disease, wastes and destroys a body and brings it to the point of not being a body at all, so all things we mentioned just now reach the point of not being when their own peculiar badness attaches itself to them, is present in them, and destroys them. Isn't that so? So he says that when injustice and the rest of the vices are present in it, does their presence in it and attachment to it corrupt and wither it until they bring it to the point of death and separate it from the body? He's talking about the soul, and the answer is no. And so from there, he concludes that because it's not destroyed by vice, he sees no evidence that the soul itself is ever, quote unquote, destroyed by vice. And so there essentially is where you have his rational argument for why the soul is immortal.
Yes, the first question that could be asked is, why do you believe that there is a soul? How can you prove that? Then the second question is, well, if there is in fact something like the soul, how are you saying that it is immortal? And so the first question, he makes a statement that's saying that the soul is immortal. He makes a statement and he just moves on. Like, he doesn't really say how he came to the point that there is in fact a soul. And I think he uses the second question to answer the first question. So bear with me here. So he says that, like you said, there are good things and bad things, good and bad. Good is what builds, bad is what diminishes or destroys. And then he gives examples of how there are good and bad things that are specific to things. Like there could be rottenness in a fruit is different, is badness for the fruit, but may not necessarily be badness for the body. We'll give an example. Like, say, wine. Wine is basically fermented grapes. The fermenting process is considered to be, it destroys the grape, but is in fact pleasurable when consumed by the body. And some people would even say that it has benefit, So, badness is unique to the grape. Now, in the case of fermentation of a grape, the grape is completely destroyed. There's nothing left of the grape. Now, same thing can be said about the human body. There are certain conditions in which the human body is completely destroyed. Now, we have looked at the body and we've had this discussion about who we are as a person. What makes the republic? Where does the republic sit? The republic is actually not the fingers and toes and things like that. It's inside the mind is where this is sitting. And so one may not have fingers and toes, but one may have an ordered republic. So if that's the case, that one could have parts of their body that is deficient or maybe decaying and dying and still have an ordered republic, that means there's a part of their body that doesn't get destroyed by something that destroys the body. So the same way, you would just by logical deduction would say that if a man is dying, is the republic inside of his mind decaying? And you would say, no, there's no reason to believe that. As a matter of fact, someone who has an ordered republic would be able to bear the process of death and decay much better than someone who doesn't have an ordered republic inside their mind. As a matter of fact, this process of disease and eventual death would build a much more firmer constitution inside of that person's mind. So that aspect that rests inside their mind is independent of the body. That is what he's calling the soul.
Right.
And he says if there is badness that affects it, the body, and the body is completely destroyed, right? There is nothing left of it. And so you would say that the human is gone. After 60, 80 years on the planet, they're gone. They no longer exist. But what is goodness for the mind? We know the goodness for the mind and the badness for the mind, for the soul, is different from what it is for the body. Now, having said that, some things overlap. Like good nutrition, good sleep,
there's going to be
food,
some convergence to some extent, right?
But
they're not inextricably linked,
no.
Right?
So, and I'm sure there are diseases of the mind as well that prevent the ordered republic from being formed inside in the first place. So, but barring that argument, what is considered to be good for the soul is what you had mentioned, the virtues, justice, temperance, courage, and wisdom. These are what build it.
In particular, the seeking of wisdom.
Yes. Right. And the more in line you are with those things, the more your soul, the more ordered your republic is. And the more you're turned away from that, the more intemperate one is, the more, if one is not courageous, one is not just, and one is not wise, then their soul is diminished. However, it's not destroyed. So one can have a completely corrupted soul and would still be functioning.
It's never gone, right?
As a matter of fact, he gives the example, like what the passages that you just read is about how injustice in and of itself, even though it is it is bad for the soul, maybe nourishing for the body in a way. Most people who are tyrannical have this spurt of energy to do these machinations. They're constantly flitting about, trying to make things happen for themselves.
Yeah, fueled by ambition.
Fueled, right. That's right. Mm-hmm. And so quite the opposite of what you believe. If you believe that the soul is and the body is one, then if there's something that corrupts the soul, should corrupt the body. The person who's unjust should die within mere moments of being totally unjust.
Right.
But it's quite the opposite of what happens. So he creates a divide between the two. And he says there are things that completely destroy the body, but there's nothing that completely destroys the soul. So the things that are bad will completely destroy. Things that are good will build. Things that are neither good nor bad will do nothing. Right? So they won't build nor destroy. So now if there exists a thing that encounters what is bad for itself and doesn't get destroyed, well, then there's nothing else that will destroy it. Right. Because it'll only encounter good or things that are of inconsequence, and so they'll be there forever.
Yeah.
And so he says, because of that logical deduction, we are saying soul is something that does not get completely destroyed by things that are bad to it. And so they live on forever because it only has good or inconsequential things that can encounter it. So that's
I think that's a great explanation for it. Because it's and like and I remember when I first read through this, I had to read this part about 3 or 4 times because it's such a large claim to be founded on such a simple logical chain. But when you see how elegantly he sort of divorces the physical with the soul aspects of things, what he's really doing is he's separating the physical. There's a venue, there's a domain of life that is action, and that's going to be what is executed by the body and what you actually do on a day-to-day basis. But then there's this realm of deliberation and decision. Mm-hmm. Now, one thing I will say though is I think Socrates did define the soul. He's at least described the soul throughout the entire dialogue, right? So when he's talking about the rational element, the appetitive, and the spirited elements. But what happens here is he adds something extra. He starts to talk about the soul in terms of an independent thing, but not only that, vis-a-vis this logical framework that he outlines.
Something that extends outside the body.
Something that extends about, and it's actually
Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. And so it's something that, I guess, within his framework that realigns everything. Because if you follow this logical chain to its conclusion, now we're going to move into the myth of because after this, he describes a myth, a useful myth that one could use to understand the relationship between the soul and the lived experience, your life. But looking at it this way, if souls cannot be destroyed, okay, then that means a soul cannot destroy another soul, right? I mean, there's corrupted souls, the bad constitutions that can feed off of other bad constitutions. But if you look at all of this that's been described in the Republic, when we talked about the deranged constitutions, there's no soul being destroyed by another soul.
Yeah.
The only thing that happens to a soul is it gets deranged. And the only thing that can derange a soul is itself.
Yeah.
Its own fallacious ideas that it can somehow take advantage of the situation and move, circumvent virtue, circumvent doing the right thing. And it's in those situations where people start to do things that would be considered bad or destructive for the individual themselves. So right?
As a matter of fact, it doesn't matter. The soul cannot be considered deranged based on 60 years of activity inside of the body. You see what I mean? If something is immortal...
Permanently, right. Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. There's so what Socrates injected here was an elasticity to the soul. Yeah. That you can twist it, and in one iteration of life, it can be very, very twisted and tyrannical. But it can always be realigned. And not only that, because the soul can't be destroyed, if you realize that everybody has a soul and it cannot be destroyed, what the heck's the point of being unjust already at that point? Yeah. There is none. Unless you have some fallacious idea that you can somehow take advantage of this situation. But you're never going to, in the process of trying to influence or do harm to another soul, you're only going to derange your own. You see what I'm saying?
I feel that there's, now that you brought it up, I feel like I've got a slightly different way to think about what I believe is when Socrates says soul, he's talking about that apex principle. The philosopher king that rests inside of your mind is...
He's not. You don't think he's talking about all three elements?
I do not think so. I think he's talking about that apex principle, the one that knows the difference between good and evil.
But he talks about these are components of the soul, right?
I think
elements of the soul.
I think what he means is that that there are, like, to give an example, a soul that is unjust. Unjust is not a property. Justice is not a property of the soul. It is something from without. It's external to it. So a soul cannot come to be. It does not go away. It's always there. A soul also is something that is not made up of complex parts. It's the simplest thing that can be. And its beauty and goodness and truth and everything lies in the fact that it is so simple. The more complex the machinations you have to have, like, the philosopher king and the guardians and then the appetitive and all of them coming together and creating this triad and pyramid, and that means that there are parts of it that can be destroyed, like the chimeric beast, subduing the human along with the lion, and they're fighting, all that stuff means that this can be corrupted.
Yeah.
So it has to be simple, and the beauty lies in its simplicity, and that simplicity is because it's immortal. It's simple. Complex things cannot be immortal. Complex things require other things to come together to make it. That means if other things have to come together to make it, it didn't exist at some point. That means cannot be immortal. The souls, the way he describes it, what he means to say by this is that be you tyrannical, be you a philosopher king, an aristocrat, or whatever, right? Whatever those constitutions are, the soul remains pure, untouched, unsullied, unaffected. It's a mere blink of an eye, whatever happens as the soul is a part of this particular construct of the body, and whatever actions are being done, nothing really taints it, stains it, kills it, destroys it. It just stays and it moves on and goes on. And that, therein lies the beauty of it all. Because there's a way to say that why be just? And why be unjust? If you take a very wide-angled view of the immortal soul, universal view of all this, it goes to show that justice, injustice, all of these are constructs that are external to the soul and may not really have as much consequence as we are putting to it. It matters more at the level of the body. This effort that you and me are doing to create a just constitution, a republic inside of us, it matters at that level. Pretty beyond that, I don't know what kind of effect it has on the soul itself. You see what I mean? Because you cannot stain it. You cannot. It is like it is the simplest, most pervasive thing that has been there forever and is going to continue to be there forever. I think there's a beauty in that way of thinking about. It ties into the concept of the one. It all comes from one thing.
Yeah, so I see what you're saying, and I'm just not willing to go as far as that, as far as what I think Socrates is talking about. I mean, I still think he's talking about the bread and butter tripartite soul in this, and I think what he's done when he moves into the myth of is he's hitched it to sort of a to a transcendental anchor when he talks about it being immortal. You brought up some things that I do agree with fundamentally outside the context of the Republic about whether justice and injustice are quote unquote real things, and in what domain, whether you're talking about the universal domain or the human domain. I think that part is debatable. But suffice it to say, I think he definitely makes the point that this is how it should be looked at. I don't know that he's saying
what is how it should be looked at.
The soul should be looked at as an immortal concept, as something that is immortal.
Yeah.
Because what it does
so you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with most of what you said. And I think if you do look at the soul that way, whether you see it as a representation of a core universal unity that can never be tainted, or whether you see it as something that's a little bit more like this transcendental framework that, can be deranged but can never be destroyed, it sort of calls into the question, what the point of being unjust is to begin with. It seems like the best thing to do would be to align yourself with the truth. And if the truth is that the soul is immutable, that the soul is indestructible, then it's that pursuit of knowledge of the soul, which he talks about, Socrates talks about, that's what you should be focused on.
Yeah.
Then that is going to have sort of a self-correcting effect in terms of the decisions you make in your life.
The reason why I bring up this aspect of what could be the soul, the construct of a soul, is because the example that he gives of the sea god Glaucus, he talks about.
Right. You're only seeing pieces of it.
You're only seeing. So he talks about this. It's a sea god, living in the sea. And because of being in that environment for eons, has now taken on this form where, things are it's like a reef, things are growing off of him. And, so...
you get this very grotesque view, and you're only getting like appearances. You're getting like angles of what it is to be the soul, but not the actual real thing.
Which would be what would happen to a soul inside of a human being. This is an allegory to what happens to the soul. So the condition we have seen, that we see the soul in, is that of the sea god Glaucus. I don't know if I'm saying this name correctly, but whose original nature cannot be easily made out by those who catch glimpses of him, because some of the original parts of his body have broken off, others have worn away and altogether been mutilated by the waves and other things, and shells, seaweed, and rocks have grown into him, so that he looks more like any wild beast than what he naturally was. And he says, he urges that we need to find a way. Let us, for the future discussion, let us imagine seeing the sea god Glaucus without of all of these things that have happened to him. So when you see the soul that way, you see that it is its purest form is its love for wisdom. In its purest form, that's what the soul is. The soul is in love with wisdom. And when it gets trapped inside this human form, then it gets trapped into all of these accompaniments of human life, and it starts going about with all these happy feastings of this appetitive element. It gets drawn into it,
right,
and then what you see,
it gets drawn into issues of honor and appetite and all that stuff that distract it, right?
And then what you see is an unjust soul, which is like saying you're seeing the sea god Glaucus and he looks grotesque because he has shells sticking out of him. The soul itself cannot be unjust. It is gotten these accoutrements that come with being a part of the human body. I thought it was a lovely visual. So that's, I think that's the conversation for the soul. Then the conversation veers away to finally, I think,
he starts talking about prizes. right?
So that's where it's coming.
Right. So because he starts talking to Glaucon, and he says, well, because living the just life, because at this point he's already made the claim. All right, he's defended the claim that the individual who is just lives a better life than the individual who is unjust. So we've already established that. And then, but he starts talking about the prizes, which is the word that he uses, that the just individual accumulates as they live the just life.
Correct.
All right.
Yeah.
They're the ones, he says, that at the end of life they find themselves, with.
Well, let's pause there, because there's a reason why he uses those exact words, because this was Thrasymachus' argument,
right? Right.
Saying that injustice is good, justice is evil. Mm-hmm. And Socrates was appalled. This was really early on. He's like, wait a minute, I can't imagine you, Thrasymachus, as saying that justice is in fact a vice and injustice is virtue. He's like, Thrasymachus is like, yes, because this is what happens to an unjust man. And he gives this whole story about how an unjust man is perceived by others to be just. And, like your modern day politician. And, they have all the money, they have all the social contracts and public contracts, and their kids and them, they all marry into these families, they have lots of wealth, and, you see them that they are living the best lives. Yeah. Whereas a just man society is just basically shoving them to the side, and they lead miserable lives. That was the start.
It's this right. Thrasymachus had this idea of the just man being the sucker. Right, the sucker. Correct. Which is, so we've already blown that out, right?
And now, so we have finally come to a point where Socrates says, I gave you this, the argument that I was asked to make was just man versus unjust man. The unjust man is perceived to be just, and the just man is perceived to be unjust. Still, the just man would be happy. That was the argument that I was asked to support, and I have done that. Right. Now, when I have come to this end of this argument, now I've walked you through how a man who is just, and you can look inside of his mind and know for sure this man is just, not just looking at a glimpse of him from a side angle. Knowing truly what's going on inside this person's mind, the just mind would be happy. And 360 sometimes, or 3 to 6 power times happy than an unjust one. So right?
29 times. Yeah.
And so, and I'll let you come to it. But he says, now that we have shown that, would you now please give me back the argument, what is owed to me? And Glaucon is like, what is owed to you? Well, the fact that just man will be perceived as just. I made the case of a just man not perceived as just. But do you really believe that's what's going to happen? Right. So, no, go ahead.
Because now so Socrates is coming back and says, while the just man is alive, there are basically prizes and wages and gifts he receives from the gods and human beings. And then he says, in addition to those good things that justice itself provides. And again, this goes back to everything that we've talked about, the soul and having everything in alignment, and the fact that you're not a slave if you have the apex principle running things. And then he says, while they are nothing in number or size compared to those that await each man after death. So now here it is, this transition to the discussion of the afterlife, because it's a logical step. Because if you're going to talk about the immortal soul, then that's going to lead headlong into discussion about the afterlife. And here then is where Socrates talks about the myth of
There's a way that he gets to this point as well, which I thought he did really well. He talks about the rewards that are of worldly nature, and he elaborates on them. He talks about all the same stuff, that a just man would be lauded by the people around him. He would hold station in life, and
he uses the analogy of a run. Yeah. Right, the running analogy, whereas you could think of the life as a marathon, essentially, and the unjust individual, they start out fast, very popular, the first leg of the run, they're way ahead of the game, but eventually there's this sort of, again, naturally self-correcting aspect, and the unjust individual eventually reveals themselves to be unjust, and it's the individual who is just, running at the appropriate pace, tempered, not running too fast or too slow, doing everything temperately, who arrives at the first leg of the race and has enough energy to make it back, and they end up winning the race. And so he uses that analogy, which really I think was a good way to look at virtue as far as a way of pacing your life, specifically.
Not only pacing one's life.
I don't mean literally pacing,
yeah.
but I mean like this idea of
it's
the
like
middle path.
You would perform your actions like you're meant to perform them, and eventually you won't look ridiculous, because it doesn't matter how you start the race. It matters how you finish it.
Right.
That's all people remember. Nobody remembers the start of the race. Who did great at the start? They only remember the finish. Right? If you are looking to get honor from those around you, no one is going to remember your 20s and your 30s. You know, if one is lucky enough to live to their 70s, 80s, or 90s, or whatever, right? One is measured by how they held themselves toward in the sunset of their life.
But notice also somebody who would, going back to the race analogy, somebody who would dart out like that probably they're not thinking clearly. They don't have a clear view of what the race is about.
Well, they might get ahead because
they may get ahead, but they're interested in getting ahead.
That's right.
That's not the point,
that's
right?
Not the point.
Because again, their soul is skewed. They're looking at things in terms of like taking advantage of this situation and not so much doing the right thing, doing what's best.
I don't know if that necessary. I see what you mean, and maybe that's the case. But if one is not prepared themselves, have not ordered their souls, ordered their republic, no matter how they started, it's going to end badly for them. They're going to look ridiculous. Like he says here, right? Heads drooping, running off the field uncrowned.
Right, because they didn't, right. They darted out.
Well, not only if they darted out, say they finished the race, say that, when you come to the end, but you're still behaving ridiculously. Well, you see what I mean?
Right.
As opposed to somebody who's dignified at the end. But unless you understand the nature of the truth, the beauty and goodness, what in fact is, a good life. If you don't lead an examined life, your ending would not look the same way as someone else's. Socrates drank poison and died a terrible death.
Yeah. But so I guess we could distill it down further to say there's one person who has a clear idea of the race and what it means to finish, and another one who doesn't. And it's that individual who ends up not finishing the race, showing up at the end, however they happen to arrive at the end of the race.
Everybody's going to die.
Right.
Everybody's going to come to the end of that race. It is how you hold yourself up towards the end of the race. If that's what you're looking for, right? You see a person who's going through life, dignified, just. They may not look like they own much or have much, but eventually people are drawn to that. That's what gets applauded. At every stage of their life, they seem to have, they seem to have poise. They seem to have grace. They seem to have wisdom. They were able to be there for others. Purpose was driving them. Eventually, you get to see it.
Right. And then the ones that are driven by ego, the ones that are driven by flash, the ones that are driven by, again, the example I came up with is somebody who just wants to smoke right out of the line and show off. It doesn't pay off, right?
And you may, here's the thing. Say you start off of the line smoking it, like you get, and then you come upon a certain understanding of how this race should be run. You could still finish and look pretty good.
Yeah, for sure.
You're in the sunset of your life and you're behaving like you're in your 30s. It never looks good. It's not a good visual.
It's maturity.
That's right. So now we're talking about the 80 years of whatever of human life, right? Here. And that is the reward. The just men, the reward that they get is when they're old enough, they hold ruling offices in the city if they choose, marry from whatever family they choose, and give their children marriage to whoever they plead. All of these things will happen then, right? As for the unjust, the majority of them, even if they remain hidden when they are young, are caught by the end of the race and ridiculed, and by the time they get old have become wretched and are showered with abuse by foreigners and citizens, beaten with whips and made to suffer those punishments.
Right.
It's about how you end the race. That's why the just person is going to come up ahead in the eyes of other men. But that is not enough, because what about the reward for the immortal soul? What about the rewards from God? Mm-hmm. And that's when he says, okay, I have an allegory for that. Mm-hmm. That's when he comes to this.
The myth of Ur. So what he says is, hold on, I lost my place because we were talking about, so he says hold on a second.
Do you want to do this next time?
Maybe we'll do that on the next episode. But this will be, we'll end it on the transition statement that Socrates makes as he begins to talk about it, which is when he says, okay, so while the just man is alive, these are the sorts of prizes, wages, and gifts he receives from gods and human beings, in addition to those good things that justice itself provides. But then he goes on to say, well, there are nothing in number or size compared to those that await each man after death. And so here he gets into the myth of Ur. And so then I think we can talk about that on the next episode. And that'll be a wrap on Republic at that point. Because this is the culmination of the Republic, the myth of Ur. And so we'll talk more then.
All right.